a series of lectures with Lady Hall. He just delivered his second lecture this morning. And in continuation with the topic of lived religion, now this afternoon we are going to have a roundtable discussion. And what we have designed is like this. We will have four invited scholars whose work is related to lived religion, although they have their own specialties or in different religious traditions. And we will ask them, each of them, to present roughly 10 minutes, talking about their interest and what their current work is going. And after four presentations, we will ask Professor Hall to give his responses. And so I think this, because this afternoon, this morning we just ended in a very hot discussion. It seems that there was no conclusion, and I don't believe that we will have a conclusion. Yeah, and so we will simply continue our debate or different opinions, and in a very joyful, very lively discussion. So. We will then begin our roundtable section, and I'm not sure because I did not figure out which one will be first. So anyone will be four of them of our scholars? Yep. Okay. Well, let me say, just why don't you go first?
All right. So, my name is Justin Ritzinger. I am the Shengyan Visiting Scholar in Buddhist Studies here at Zhengda this semester. I work on modern Chinese Buddhism, basically 20th century, but sometimes contemporary things as well, both in China and Taiwan. And so I see myself as sort of sitting at the juncture between both Buddhist studies and Chinese religion, which have very different disciplinary histories and backgrounds. So I would begin by speaking a little bit biographically and then talking about what I think are some of the key lessons to be learned from lived religion approaches, and then illustrate those lessons with a few things from my own work. So when I did my undergraduate degree, I was really trained by someone who was kind of an old school Buddhologist, right? So someone who did sort of the Buddhism equivalent of church history. So when I did Intro to Buddhism with him, it was very much an intellectual history approach where we went from sort of movement to movement to movement to movement, right? So you begin with the Buddha, and then you talk about, right, early Buddhism, and then you talk about Abhidharma, right? Then you talk about Madhyamaka, Yogacara, right, Huai and Tiantai, sort of going on through school by school. And I learned a great deal from him. He was a wonderful professor. But when I went to China for the first time, and then when I subsequently came to Taiwan, right, things were very, very different than what I had learned. But I had learned the history of Buddhism as the elaboration of emptiness, right, Kong, right, and all the different versions of that. And then I go to an actual temple in China, and I see dozens of old ladies who, whenever they hear anything, just for a second, Ami Tofu, right? And it seemed so Baptist to me, right? It seemed like so very un-Buddhist, and yet here it was, and this was what people were doing. A monk that I hung out with showed me relics, right, Shaliza, of his mother. I would hear stories about miraculous events when images were consecrated. Then later I came to Taiwan, where I ended up spending several years, and I worked for Dharma Drum Mountain for Bagushan as a translator. So I got to see an actual monastic organization on the inside. I translated for Master Shengyan, so I got to hear a lot of his stories, things about being blocked by ghosts, right? Big Wei Dan, and things like that that aren't supposed to be things that Ren Jian Guojiao talks about, right? But he does. And then I married a Taiwanese woman, so I also got sort of a family view on Taiwanese religion and sort of the many multiple religious traditions that can coexist and be negotiated, or sometimes not negotiated in a Taiwanese family. So that's, by the way, a kind of biographical background, and I think putting your own body in your work where possible is very important for being sensitized to some of those kind of issues. If you're very far removed physically, it can be hard to see what things look like on the ground. Now, within Buddhism and within Chinese religions, people don't really talk about lived religion, right? It's not really a category. I looked around, I tried to find anybody who actually used the term lived religion. Philip Clark talks about it in one article. That seems to be it. There are people who do it. Our Shijian, Bev McGuire, wrote a wonderful book called Living Karma that looks at the life of Obi Jirshu through his religious practices. Justin McDaniel wrote a wonderful book called The Lovelorn Ghost and the Magical Monk that takes a more anthropological approach to contemporary Thai Buddhism. So there are people who are taking this approach, but they tend not to use the term very much. And I also don't typically think of myself in those terms. I think I was invited because I was here, and I do sometimes do field work based approaches, and so I seemed like a possible candidate. And so what I want to do is sort of talk about some of the lessons of that kind of approach, even for those of us who might not think of ourselves as doing lived religion, right? Who might not be trying to meticulously reconstruct religious life worlds in the way that, say, Bob Orsi does. Right, so I think the three things that are lessons for all of us are the emphasis on concrete practice, embedded human lives, and the multivalency of symbols. Right? I think part of what this does for us is it helps to undermine and illuminate the fictional character of our categories. Right? Buddhism, religion, ritual, all of these things are fictions. Useful fictions, oftentimes necessary fictions, probably, but ultimately what we in the Buddhism side of things would call upaya, right? 就是一个方便而已，不是一个那个事实。So, and when you can recognize the sort of fictional category or the fictional nature of those categories, it opens up new avenues for inquiry. So what I'd like to do, even though I think I was invited because of my field work, I'm going to talk about some of my historical work and the way in which in my current book project, which I'm trying to finish up now, lived religions, so concrete practice, embedded lives, and multivalency of symbols, has helped me to sort of see beyond pre-established categories and open up new areas of research. So the first one is simply the topic of the book itself. Right? So this book, in its origins, goes back quite far biographically for me. When I was an undergraduate, I wrote my thesis about Taishu, right, who some of you might know was an important modernizing figure in the first half of the 20th century. When I wrote this thesis, I basically said, right, what the received wisdom was, right? So he's a modernizer, he is demythologizing, right, 去神话, right? So he wanted to get rid of mythological elements. He was sort of secularizing. He focused on inner-worldly asceticism and sort of those kind of more Bavarian approaches to modernity. But when I was doing my research and I turned to Chinese sources, I read a remembrance by one of his students, and one of the things that they talked about was, oh, the master likes to practice Bila Jingtu, right, Maitreya Pure Land, which is not something that Taishu was supposed to be doing, right? If you read everything that had been written about him in English, much of what had been written in Chinese, he's not supposed to like that stuff, right? That stuff is supposed to be bad, right? That's the bad Buddhism that Taishu is supposed to be against, and yet here he was doing it, right? And this was before Google, So I couldn't even figure out what this thing was. Right? I had no idea what Maitreya Pure Land was even really about, but I had this nagging suspicion that I was wrong. Right? That the thesis that I had written was in some way deeply flawed, because here he was doing something that all my categories told me he should not be doing. When I went back to this topic in graduate school, it opened up a whole new avenue on a figure who's actually fairly well studied in Chinese and sort of well studied in English. Right? If you look at him through the avenue of concrete practice, if you look for Maitreya, suddenly you find a devotional side to this movement that has been portrayed as very secular and secularizing. Right? People have said, and I quote, Taishu wanted to get rid of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Right? He wanted to create a pure land on this earth and not go to be reborn in a pure land elsewhere. This is wrong. Right? It is not, in fact, true at all. Right? That's what our categories want us to think, or lead us to think. But if you look at what he says about Maitreya, he wants to be reborn in Maitreya's heaven, in Tushita heaven. He wrote liturgies. Right? He recited Maitreya's name. He had his students recite Maitreya's name. He lectured on Maitreya's sutras more than any other text. Right? And in fact, when we talk about the Pure Land on Earth, for Taishu, the Pure Land on Earth is inaugurated by the coming of Maitreya. So rather than the Pure Land on Earth being a secularization of Amitabha's Pure Land in the West, it's actually a kind of enchantment of Western notions of progress. So by looking at it from the avenue opened up by concrete practice, suddenly there's this whole new dimension to this movement that's been largely ignored. Now, the second aspect came for me by trying to trace this back. Where does he get some of these ideas? Where does he get the underlying values? Where does he get his notions of progress? And if you look at him in terms of his embedded life, it also opens up new avenues. People have tended to look at Taishu solely as a Buddhist figure. Right? Taishu Dashi, right? He is a Buddhist master. In his own biography, or his own autobiography, he kind of writes about himself that way. Or they look at him as a religious figure, right? And they seek influences on his thought in Christianity. But if you look at his actual life, he didn't really have any deep association with Christianity, right? Where he got his visions of progress, where he got all sorts of things, was actually from anarchism, which was sort of covered up to a degree in his autobiography, right? Because he wanted to present himself as a Buddhist figure. When he was writing in the 1940s, anarchism had been purged from the Kuomintang, and so it was kind of an embarrassment. But he was actually deeply involved in the anarchist movement after the 1911 revolution. He was a great leader of the anarchist movement, and because I looked at him as simply a person, right, who had a full life that involved not only religion but also politics, I uncovered essays that he had written for anarchist journals that had been lost. Right? In previous studies of him, people looked at only the Taishu Chuanshu, right, the complete writings, but the complete writings are not actually complete. Right? There's actually quite a lot that's not in them, but it says Chuan, right? So everybody assumes it must be Chuan. Right? So I was able to recover these lost texts, right, find sources of his ideas that have been overlooked, and also uncover sources of some of his skills, right? He was famous for his role in publishing. People had often assumed that this was Christian influence, but he didn't learn how to edit a journal from Christians. He learned how to edit a journal by editing anarchist journals. Right? So he actually picked it up from secular sources, not from Christianity, but we tend to think, well, Buddhism is a religion, Christianity is a religion, therefore, right, it must be apples and apples, right, rather than apples and oranges. The final sort of avenue that I think political religion opens up is the multivalency of symbols, right? So symbols can have many meanings and can be the property of many different groups, right? So looking back, I sort of identified the roots of Taishu's Maitreyan thought, of of the reformist movements, Maitreyan thought, in anarchism. But taking it forward, I tried to look at how it interacted with other visions of Maitreya, because as most of you know, right, Mila is not just important to Buddhism, right? He's a god of wealth. He's important to all sorts of popular religious movements. And so one of the things that I discovered was that when the Maitreya school died out or declined in Buddhism in the 1950s and the 1960s, one of the reasons was probably that it looked a bit too much like Yiguan Dao, right? Because Yiguan Dao, right, places some emphasis on Maitreya. It probably looked a little bit sketchy, and there were all sorts of other political problems that reformist Buddhists had at that time. But as I started to look more about what Yiguan Dao actually said about Maitreya, I discovered something very interesting. Just as Maitreya school was declining within Buddhism, it was actually getting taken up by Yiguan Dao. So originally, Yiguan Dao's vision of Maitreya is very different than Taishu's, than sort of orthodox Buddhist version. That starts to change in the 1980s. Right? For various reasons, Yiguan Dao has a crisis of legitimacy in the 1980s. The last patriarch, Sun Suzhen, dies. There's controversy about spirit writing. Right? Someone basically confesses that all of the spirit writing, right, the Fulai, is actually fake, and talks about how she did it. And so they start to turn to scriptures, right, to Jingwan as a new source of authority. And people have talked a lot about turning to Confucian scriptures, but they also turn to Buddhist scriptures. And since Maitreya was already important, scriptures about Maitreya were the obvious place to go. But what do these scriptures mean, right? We need to have authoritative interpretations, and so they actually looked to Taishu and to Yinshun. So Taishu and Yinshun's ideas about Maitreya actually ended up having probably their greatest influence outside of Buddhism in Yiguan Dao and later in Mila Dada. Right? Mila Dada actually takes that stream of Maitreya Pure Land and really makes it foundational for what they're doing. So that's just kind of a quick sampler plate of what I think 3 key lessons are of this kind of approach and how they've informed my own work. I think they're especially important for the study of Chinese religion because so many of the categories that we have for the study of Asian religions come from Christianity, and Chinese religion is so much different, right? There is a radical multiplicity to Chinese religion, both past and present. There are so many more religious actors, right? There was the state, the Buddhist clergy, the Taoist clergy, right? There was redemptive societies, right? So things like Yiguan Dao, Bagua Jiao, local temples, right? The granny on the corner who did feng shui, right? There were so many different people, all with their own vision of what was happening. And I think we have to be very suspicious of the labels that we use because they tend to falsify that multiplicity. I also think that it's important because, right, there is a kind of promiscuous fluidity, right? Things go back and forth and get translated among these different traditions so that nothing is the sole property of any one of them, right? Just because the Confucians talk about shao, right, filial piety, does not mean that every time you hear the word shao, someone is being Confucian, right? It's like in US politics, just because the Republicans talk about family values does not mean that only Republicans like families. Right? So lived religion approaches, I think, are important because actual religious people don't know that they shouldn't do the things that we think they shouldn't do. Right? They don't know that if they're trying to be modern, that they have to be modern in the way that, say, Weber thought modernity should work. We are creatures who create abstractions, but we're not really capable of living in the kind of fully rationalized, abstract way that we sometimes spit out. Okay, thank you.
Apologize that I missed the introduction part. Our 4 presenters this afternoon. are, we just heard the first one, the first presenter, Professor Resinger. He's assistant professor of Miami University, and he came here as a visiting scholar at the NCCU. And our second one will be Professor Huang Kexian. He is assistant professor of sociology at Taiwan National University. And the third one is Professor Luo Shijie, who is also assistant professor at the Department of History, also of the Taiwan National University. And the fourth one will be Dr. Gao Xiangliang, assistant researcher of the Academia Sinica. I'm sorry I did not mention you first because I was eager to jump into our table discussion. So, yeah, sorry about that. And so now the second one will be Professor Huang, please.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So it's my honor to have the opportunity to join this roundtable to discuss about labor religion, which Professor Debbie Hall has pioneered to coin. So for a sociology of religion trend in the US, like me, it's very seductive to pay attention exclusively to explicit and institutionalized manifestations of religion. When we would like to look at how people maintain a relationship with extraordinary power, it seems so natural to go into a church or a temple and ask religious specialists about how religion works. We are looking at rituals, worship services, or activities defined as religious. Since we limit our imagination of religion only to certain domains, certain personnel, and certain aspects of life, sociologists of religion has been losing sight of how possibly religion appears in places we once ignored. However, in the recent decade, Nancy Emmermans and other sociologists of religion already bring this exciting approach of lived religion, or so-called everyday religion, to the front stage to sociologists of religion. Now I would use my recent study to illustrate how this exciting approach helped me to facilitate my research. So recently I'm doing an ethnographic research on a park full of the homeless people in the Manga area of Taipei, Taiwan. One of the things I try to figure out is how they sustain their life. So one of the important sources for their living are from organized religions or mission groups, particularly Christianity. A lot of researchers have write a lot of articles and books about that. However, I think religions probably connect to helping homeless people in another way, once treated trivial, yet I think very important. In the field, I find many individual donators coming to spread food to these homeless people. They are, of course, religiously motivated, but not by organized religious groups. They considered this charity as critical in proving their beliefs and accumulating their merits for salvation. However, their religiosities do not so much depend upon any specific institution or groups, but are embedded within a living environment full of religious ideas and practices. They might accompany their elderly relatives to visit a very prestigious temple called Longshansi, where homeless people gather around. They would be asked by their elder relatives to show religious sympathy and filial obedience by giving money to these homeless people. So they might belong to friendship circles engaging in some unlawful, risky yet lucrative jobs, such as winning an underground lottery, selling drugs or facilitate prostitute industry, that kind of stuff. So they get a lot of money, a lot of so-called dirty money from this kind of jobs, and which might bring uneasiness into their conscience. Thus, their friends would recommend them to use this money to do something good religiously in order to get some kind of salvation or peace inside their mind. So some of the donators might be organized by a temple or Buddhist community. However, a lot of them are doing charity out of their own will and spread food alone, not with any company. So when these lone donators spread food, they tend to say to these homeless people, "Come, let's develop a deep virtuous affinity with you." 来，我让你跟你来结个善缘。So recently, the government want to have a more orderly regime of donating food to homeless people in the park. So the government prohibit from personal distributing things to homeless people in the park. So if you doing so, the police will come and give you a ticket. And the government asks donators to give their donation to the nearby social welfare office and then transfer this food to the homeless people. However, this governmental centralization of donation aroused a lot of complaints from donators. The donators understand the goals of this new measure, but they refuse to obey it. They simply don't want any mediation between them and this receiver. The mediation could mean a broken attempt to develop virtuous affinity and fail to accumulate religious merits. So the logic also applies to mediation of religious organization. So they don't want any involvement of temples or Buddhist community in their individual donating behaviors. So these donators rather come along to the park rather than join the coding of a religious organization. They want their charity to be purely personal and individual. This seemingly individualistic religious ethos could be found in many different behavior patterns among Taiwanese people. Charity is just one of them. So these individualistic ethos are definitely not the result of a late coming modernization, but a part of the Chinese tradition, which is sometimes reduced as collectivist culture. If we only study temple, if we only look at religious specialists, if we simply attend ritual and ceremony, this important religious practice of charity I just mentioned might be otherwise ignored. However, lived religion approach just highlights this important aspect of religiosity, which has prevailed in Eastern religious contexts, of course, as well as any place where individual spirituality compared to traditional type of religiosity become more important. This is why today it is so worthy to talk about lived religion here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Yeah. So our third presenter will be Professor Luo. He's going to use his PT. Yeah.
It's my great honor to be here to talk about my research to such an important scholar in this field. And okay. Oh yeah, there it's coming. Nice. Yeah, okay. And my name is Roger Sijego, and my dissertation is actually about a city in China, and I'm talking about how religion functions politically in Chinese society. I'd like to understand how common people, especially how they use kinship organization as well as religion, to get themselves organized to deal with history or to deal with the rest of society. And I'm actually in the process of preparing my book, a book called Religious in Wenzhou, A Modern History. And I just published an article in 2012. It's about how local people they use God to deal with the empire, the region with the empire. And then from 2012 to 2015, I published three articles. The first article is actually I talk about the so-called local secret society tradition. And for a very long time, Chinese government and eventually the empire, they consider the secret society as evil things, And I kind of want to, reverse, this, idea. I kind of argue that actually they are local people and they are some kind of like just Curti just mentioned, they are local charity people. They just get together. And the thing is, by the end of the Qin Empire, actually the Qin Empire system, they kind of authorize people. They acknowledge people in the power, and they say, okay, you can be part of my, my governmental team. And that's why, and sometimes people get rebelled. That's why this so-called rebellion happens. And then the 2015, this article, and I just find a very interesting case in the local people's diary. Say they know people, and the people named Huang Shishu, the second line, the Huang Shishu. He born in 1974 and died in 1947. The case is in 1949. In the turns out this guy became the local god. Yeah, and I kind of figure out how Kuomintang, the KMT, and the CCP, and Chinese Communist Party, they kind of want to manipulate this story, to convince people, hey, I'm doing the good things. I'm just like the city gods, and the city god is obviously a very important tradition all the way from the 1st century, in China. And the last year, I published another article about the secretarial code, and this is actually I kind of want to probably it's kind of follow Professor Justin's point. And kind of I kind of think it's possible we can think. For a very long time we think, Chinese we have like 5 religions, so far 5 religions. Okay, how about the Confucianism, the Taoism, Buddhism. We spend a lot of time to talk about Confucianism, and we also spend a lot of time to talk about how Confucianism has been popularized in the local society. But what about Taoism and Buddhism? And it turns out, from this case study, I find out from the family, actually a so-called, local, actually a family called Yao Wenyu family. I just figure out actually they've been running local charity, activities, throughout all the way from 16th century to 19th century, and the space they cover is actually probably 3 times of the size of New England. Yeah, and a very important tradition, but for a very long time we just think, this is evil code, and this is not good because it is not part of the government, government orthodoxy. And right now I'm doing 2 articles. The 2 articles, the first article is about to finish. I kind of want to understand, the rebellion happened in 1900 in Wenzhou, and then I find out, for a very long time people call this uprising, the Bastard uprising. They are all bad people, they are bastards, they hate with foreigners. But turns out I find out why they want to against the foreigners because they compete for the local south, the local community, and actually all for maybe realistic reasons. And then the next article is I'm about to do is I like to think how Chinese people use ritual to deal with politics. Just like for a very long time we think symbol is very important, but we all know, every ritual, every ritual consists of a series of symbols, and these symbols come from different, religious tradition. And to the intellectual, we think, we can easily identify, this is from Confucianism, this is from Taoism, this is from Buddhism. But how about local people? Eventually, when local people they all realize after fieldwork, after doing fieldwork in Wenzhou for 10 years, then they realize the people they realize, we want to use religion to address political concerns. Yeah, and sometimes we can get some kind of temporary solution, during the region, something like that. So that's why the article I'm kind of say, there's kind of they use religion or they use a region to deal with the armed conflict. And right now I'm also doing research actually about actually about the religion and marginal people, the case study of Dadahui. And this case is, Dadahui is actually very important in the part of 20th century Chinese new religion movement. So far, I hope I make myself very clear. I think religion is kind of very important, driving force in local society, and people need to form their own community, or people need to form a kind of to have their own power. Yeah, and how I figure this out is because I think the temples and the rituals are not a product of timeless expression of Chinese culture. They are a product of history and there are stories behind them. But for a very long time, we just think, oh, their story just belong to so-called, belong to Tuabe, belong to Taoism, Buddhism, or belong to the leader, or belong to the founder, or belong to some famous guy in the Indian religion. But turns out, how about common people? And how about common people? They possibly they will use religion. They will use religion, or they will rely on religion, or they will take advantage of religion language, to do something politically. Yeah, and turns out this is why I tell my students. And I also like to know, what Professor Hall think about that. It is very important for me to go to the field work, to do some interviews. But it's not only about interviews. Actually, I think that I just kind of want to share this idea with you, to know what you think about it. Every time I enter a village, the first time we will check the virtual environment. Then we'll think how people live. How will they live within this environment? Then we'll figure out how they do by living, what kind of thing they will do, and will this be related to their religion. Then next we will talk about the lineage organization. Then the next we will talk about local infrastructure. Then the next will be a temple system. For a very long time, we just keep kind of thinking, oh, the temple. Then we start to talk about religion. But turns out, the temple might be the very late development in a community. Yeah, because they need to use temple to what? To let people to all, to feel they belong to the same community, to build local infrastructure, to feel they belong to the same, lineage organization, and to belong to the same, local economic activities. And then after we talk about temple organization, then probably I think especially in China, in Taiwan, it's very important to talk about festivals. Yeah, because by using festivals, different regions of people, they will work together, even different temples, different gods, they will work together happily. Yeah. Then finally, we can talk about local politics. What I think I learned from my past, I learned from my PhD, around this is I think it's very important. The very first day my advisor told me, hey Roger, all politics is local. Yeah. Then Then I kind of then I think if all politics is local, also what is the feature of the Chinese political culture? Yeah. And how can we use common people like laymen and women's viewpoint to rethink the Chinese culture? Is it just an empire, or is it just like like a so-called Orientalism? I can't doubt. Yeah. So how religion and this kind of my idea about the so-called deep religion. I probably it's kind of too fundamentalist, but I still want to share it. How religion functions politically in local society, I think sometimes with history, and story became advocacy. Then advocacy became discourse. Then discourse became the politics. Then politics became power. And the power could be everywhere. Power just like Foucault said. Then power became money or donation, whatever. Then finally, then money became more stories. It's kind of a cycle. It's kind of a cycle, and I love to say this. I love to mention this to my students. I say, hey, think about it. The significance of Taiwan, the significance of Taiwan and Taiwanese in the world is what? On the media, almost every day, we can learn different types of stories about God just on the media. Every day. The temples, the people, or how people use religion every day. Yeah. And then the next is actually the material I just used. How can I develop my research? Is pretty much because for the past probably 2 decades, Chinese scholars they kind of they slowly moving out of their moving out of library, and they go to field, and they go to people's house to get their materials. And it turns out, I'm actually very lucky. I'm very lucky to get this people's diary, and he start to keep diary all the way from 1880s to 1942 every day. And he is actually a show size kind of lower degree Capuchins. And as you can tell, the time span of life is actually from 1860 to 1942. So it's kind of how Chinese people they need to address the concept of modernity. So he needs to adjust. He needs to make a bit of adjustment to almost everything. And in his article, just like in his diary, just like that, he spent a lot of time to talk about how should we use. Well, he talked about his idea about religions, all the way from should we worship Sanyasen? Should we worship the KMP? How can we do with local festivals? Yeah, and what is the use of festivals? And for a very long time, we think, this group of people just like that, they are kind of conservative. They love tradition. They hate change. But turns out, I think as a people, probably just like that. I think maybe it's our role on this plane is not to worship God, but to create it. So it turns out, from my so far from I did my research as well as with the whole really important idea of the deep religion. I think the people keep doing that. So and I'm kind of wondering how will you do that? How will you address this? Response to this actually writer. Yeah. How will you respond to this? Because it turns out that every time every generation of people actually have their own questions. Yeah. And I just remember the other days I have a very important, I have a very interested in the conversation with my students. And I think would it be possible, all probably like in Hsinchu, like all people always PhDs, but they decide to build a temple and worship a god, they can bring them children. Yeah. If this happens, can we still say this is this still religion? Yeah. Or how if this religion content is very useful to this, and I'm kind of wondering, how the whole will help us to develop this idea with your maybe very rich ideas about these fields. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, I think we have already accumulated a lot of things, and Debbie, now you have a very heavy mind. I'm sure you are powerful enough to receive one more. Okay, our last one, Dr. Dao.
It's a pleasure and honor to participate in this roundtable discussion. I will present a case study from my fieldwork and explore how partisanism was perceived and practiced in rural areas during China's Cultural Revolution. I will also consider the value of lived religion approach in this case study. On a Sunday morning in 1971, a man attended a Christian home gathering in Pingtang Island for the first time. This man, Mr. Xu, had been a spirit medium for 11 years. He wanted to get rid of his affiliated spirit and thus sought help from Christians. When a group of women worshipping there were praying for him, the possession showed effect. He became fierce-looking and violent. He said to them, "You belong to the Mount of Olives, but I belong to Mount Ermei." One of the women stepped forward, grabbing his hand in the name of Jesus until he regained consciousness. He was thrilled that Jesus was able to overcome the spirit within him. He became one of the first Christians in his village. The Cultural Revolution has been well known for its ruthless suppression of religious activities. For a period of time, it seemed that China had become a completely secular state. The Cultural Revolution is hence often conceived as an antithesis of the religious revival in China since the 1980s. But some evidence suggests that Partisanism possibly grew during this period. according to official statistics. After the long period of unification measures from 1956 to the end of the 1970s, the number of Catholics and Muslims remained the same, while the number of Protestant Christians rose from 0.8 million to 3 million. Sources of oral history accounts also confirm that Protestant growth in many parts of rural areas can trace back to the early 1970s. The Cultural Revolution might therefore be a crucial formative period for Protestantism in China today. In the following, I provide a brief Protestant history in Pingtan and give an account of the conversion story of Xu Tongkang, the aforesaid spirit medium. Pingtan is situated in southeastern Fuzhou. Protestantism in this island followed the American Methodist tradition and was, before the communist liberation, particularly influential in the local society through educational and medical services. After the liberation, the government appropriated mission schools and hospitals. Pastors and ministers who received letters from former missionaries were accused of being special agents and executed. Others were sent to labor camps during waves of political campaigns. All chapels were closed down during the period of the Great Leap Forward in 1958, except the one in the county town that barely survived until the start of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Mr. Xu had been a fisher in Tianjin region in Pingtan. One day, after having a drink in the house of a spirit medium, he began to exhibit abnormal behaviors. He laid on bed all day long. Strange noises came out of his body. At times, he could not help but scream savagely outside the house. When his 3-year-old daughter died, a witch proclaimed that a god intended him to be its spirit medium. He resisted for a period of time, but the mental and the physical illness eventually brought him to submit. He became a successful medium, particularly good at revealing fishes where to reap an abundant harvest. He was also capable of healing the sick and dealing with various requests. As people from neighboring villages came to consult the spirit, he appeared conversible. Out of his mouth came a variety of dialects. But once claimant left, he became violent toward family members, beating his wife, children, parents, and siblings. When the Cultural Revolution broke out, the family was grateful that the Red gods came to devastate god statues in their house. However, the spirit took revenge later on. Mr. Xu came to be possessed fiercely, shouting at everyone. One of his nephews next door started to have asthma attacks and bleed from his eyes, ears, nostrils, and the mouth. The family had no choice but put together god statues once again. One day, someone told the family that Jesus was able to drive away all sorts of demons. Mr. Xu took heed of this message. However, as there was no church or pastor, how could he find Jesus? For a year or so, he consulted everyone where to find Christians. In fact, his sister had brought her son, the bleeding boy, to turn to Jesus for protection. Nevertheless, they and other Christians dare not tell Mr. Xu how to believe in Jesus, lest they would be harmed by the Spirit. Since Christians around refused to convert him, in October 1971, Mr. Xu decided to believe in Jesus by himself. He swept away the god statues with an iron stick. He requested his family members to kneel down outside the house, besought Jesus in heaven to save him, and burn the god statues. Relatives came to persuade him not to substitute an unknown god for a surely powerful and sadistic one. Was Jesus powerful enough and trustworthy? That was the pressing question. Mr. Xu made up his mind to take the risk. The news of his conversion spread to Christian underground groups. From then on, Christians started to pray for him and receive him. A careful reading of Protestant life stories, such as Mr. Xu's one, indicates a general change in the religious arena during the Cultural Revolution. When communal religious life was destroyed, private religious activities continue to exist throughout the Cultural Revolution. New religious arena became heavily experiential in emphasis, characterized by practices dealing with misfortune and illness. Lack of religious authorities such as the Bible and church institutions, Protestant religiosity featured visions, dreams, healing, and driving away demons. I will skip the next part. Protestant religiosity during the Cultural Revolution poses a unique question regarding to how we understand Christianity. Christianity is normally identified by its teachings, rituals, traditions, or institutions. Applying these criteria, since there was no Bible doctrine, clergy, or church institution, there was no such thing as Christianity during the Cultural Revolution. And we may ask, in Mr. Xu's story, in what sense can we call the lay women's secret meeting a Christian one? Was there really a conversion taking place? What exactly did Mr. Xu convert to? I suggest that here we see the contribution of lived religion approach. Lived religion aims to chart the practices of the laity and to explicate their multiple, ambiguous, and even contradictory meanings. In this way, it enables us to investigate Protestant religious life in the absence of the church from the perspective of practice. Mr. Xu's struggling with the spirit, his determination of burning God's statues, and the women's practice of exorcism all convey meanings that needed to be explored. Not only sins and praying, but also dreams, visions, healing, and driving away spirits constitute what Protestantism was lived in this spirit. However, I think that here we also face a challenge in the study of lived religion. While the approach attaches importance to the ambiguity of meanings, it may be less capable to specify a conversion process. Protestants' life story during the Cultural Revolution usually included elements of Chinese popular religion, such as local spirits, illness they cause, the practices of healing and exorcism. Some scholars such conclude that Protestant converts were, I quote, products of Chinese popular religion, end quote. If it is so, we cannot achieve that by burning God's statues and praying to Jesus. Mr. Xu turned to another faith. Was it possible that Mr. Xu and other so-called converts continue to practice a form of Chinese popular religion in the name of Jesus? This religion can be an effective approach to examine how everyday practices blurred traditional religious boundaries, but might be efficient in deciding whether and to what extent Protestant converts made a real break from their local religious culture. Since the lived religion is, quote, fluid, mobile, and incompletely structured, end quote, the challenge is, how can we pin down the meaning of practice and arrive at a categorical statement on its significance? This challenge raises the issue of how to theorize practices. And I would like to learn more about the place of theories such as sociological and anthropological ones in the study of religion. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for all of you. You made a very wonderful presentation, and I was amazed by the, how well you prepared. I thought that you simply would throw out, very spontaneously, but obviously you have written all your questions and opinions in such a official, in a very formal style. But I will simply give the rest of time, to Professor Hall.
Well, I echo what was just said. This is excellent work and challenging work to which to respond. So I'm going to, I'm terrible at pronouncing Chinese names, so I'm going to have to point here in terms of to whose work I'm speaking. But I want to offer a couple of general comments to begin with. So let me just repeat some of the words that kept recurring in these 4 presentations. One of those words is the word ritual. It came up several times. Another word is the word modernizer, or modernizing, came up several times. Authority, the word authority came very much foreground in the 3rd paper, but also present elsewhere. There's the word origins, came up, or which was again raised a number of times, but in the most recent paper, raised in a very specific way. How did Mr. Now I can't give you his name in a full Chinese pronunciation. Xu. How did Mr. Xu acquire his beliefs? An origins question. And finally, there's a word that there's the word local. So let me start with the word local. And let me just say that in general, the question of space, where the space that we are examining, the household, the individual life, the kinship network, the town, the region, the empire, the dynasty, the church, the denomination, space matters in terms of the nature of the inquiry that is going to follow. It has a large role in the shape of the story that you're going to tell. So the local. And I could talk too long about the local, but I myself am writing a book in which I want to talk about, one of the chapters talks about the relationship between center and local in England and Scotland in the 17th century around the question of disciplinary religion, which on the whole the center didn't want, but in certain localities people did want. And what I've learned is that it's very easy to have a model. It's very tempting to have a model where the local resists or ignores the center. That's a very, very appealing model. But when I look closely at my local places, there's always conflict in the local place. So, and ultimately that conflict has something to do with the center. In other words, the center may have its representatives in the local who have to report back to, let's say, the empire or the monarchy, whatever the political situation is. And so the local becomes itself a challenging term. It's not purely local. And the same is true, you used the word, you're the only one I think you used it, I'm looking at you, the only one who used the word politics so strongly, made such a central role. And so in the towns that I'm looking at for England and Scotland and also New England, the first impression we might have is everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. That's the first impression. The second impression is everybody is filing lawsuits against everybody else in the town. And they're not agreeing. So historians, I'm going to use a word that in England, in English plays an important role. The history of community is haunted by the notion of harmony. Small-scale communities are happy communities, harmony communities. But I would pose the question back to you, whether the local communities you are describing or part of your research really are so united, whether they are so united. The great topic in Scottish history is witch hunting, because you look at a village that seems peaceful, and then all of a sudden you discover that some of the villagers are accusing someone being a witch, a disruptive figure. And so we can see through the lens of witchcraft and witch persecutions that already in this village or town there are elements of conflict. So it's like a series of boxes within boxes. So even the local is a category that I would be a little suspicious of. I think it's a useful category, a very useful category. But it's not a pure category because it too is a political category. It involves a notion of autonomy, which is always being negotiated. It's always being negotiated. And there are periods when there's less and more, periods of more conflict, less conflict. So that going back to your word politics, of course there's a politics. Of course it's political. Then we are also in the realm of deciding what politics means, what the word politics means. So now there's a word that I didn't put on my list of short words, and that's the word charity, or doing good for others, which came up in a couple of the papers. And so at least in Christianity, I can't speak for Buddhism or other Chinese religions, versions of religion. In Christianity, there is the notion of the gift. You give someone a gift that redeems that person. And of course, this goes back to the figure of Jesus, who redeemed. This is the Christian story. God gave Jesus as a gift to us to redeem us. So there's a Latin phrase, imitatio Christi, to imitate Christ by giving a gift. Now, in true Christianity, the gift has to be pure, like Jesus, pure, not self-interest. I don't get anything from the gift. I just am giving the gift as sacrifice. That's Jesus was the sacrifice. In the book I edited on Live Religion, there is a fascinating essay on gift giving, in which it shows how there's a constant tension, a continual tension between the pure gift and the impure gift, and how the two meanings, pure and impure, are. You say, in America we give gifts, in Taiwan you give gifts. We say, oh, this is a pure gift, and the person looks at you, their eyes narrow, and they say, pure gift, pure gift. There's some hidden meaning to this gift, some purpose to this gift. And so there's tremendous pressure in Christianity to purify the gift, not have the state be involved, have it come from the heart, have it be an act of sacrifice. So I just want to say that as soon as you mention that in your papers, it's a theological matter. It's a theological framework. This is imitating Jesus. Now, the fact of the matter is that giving a gift to someone creates an obligation. It always creates an obligation. It creates an obligation. Again, Christian theology is very specific about this. Jesus gives us new life. Free, it's free. Free grace. It turns out we are obliged to obey God's law and be like Jesus. So it's not free at all. It isn't free. Even in the theology, it's free, but not free. So I just would remind you of this, that the gift-giving process, the process of helping others within, I think, any religion, but especially within Christianity, it's like the old poisoned apple. Oh, this apple looks so delicious. Take a bite of the apple. Well, something is happening to me that I didn't expect. So I just remind you that of the doubleness of these organizations that seem so purely religious, so purely sacrificial, self-sacrificial and religious, and perhaps they're not. only in one paper did the word devotion, your paper, I think, come up. Right? And you emphasized it quite strongly, but it could have been used in other papers. And I would urge all of you, as I urged unsuccessfully most of my students, I would urge all of you to take devotional practice seriously. It's what people do. People engage in devotion. And whether it's households or churches or many other ways. And what interests me about devotion, let me just tell you what interests me, it's repeated acts of devotion. In this sense, I'm more sociological than I am cultural, because devotion, repeated acts of devotion. Look for recurrences of devotion that you can actually, observe and in some ways count. That's why this diary might be of such importance to you, because it gives you a record of systematic behavior here. But devotion, or to use another English word, worship, is really what religion is about. It's not about belief. Belief is there, but religion is really about devotion. And that's why I said this again and again to my students, and I couldn't get them to agree with me on this. And I don't mean to say that you have to agree with me on it either. But then devotion is sister to ritual. Devotion leads you to ritual, or as you said, festivities, the festival. And the possibilities for analyzing festivals are endless. Do they enforce or strengthen the rules? Do they change the rules? Do they put on display hierarchies? Do they overturn those hierarchies? It's such a fascinating question, all of which Clifford Geertz in his own work exposed, actually. The symbols. So I again, in Worlds of Wonder, my own book, there's a chapter on ritual, in which I don't, it's very incomplete, really only at the beginning of an inquiry, but ritual is just extremely important. Now, what word have I mentioned that I haven't come back to? On my little list, tell me some word I have. Modernizing. Okay, tomorrow afternoon, when I turn to case studies, I'm going to mention one of the case studies will be a case from Mexico, a remarkable case, not mine, by another scholar that I'm borrowing. So I'll return to the question of modernizers, but it's so interesting how in the history of religion there are recurrent efforts to curtail and to denounce and exclude the scope. So we think of modernizers as of our time, modern. But actually, if we can use it, we can take the term back into time. We can say reformers, or purists, or rigorists, or rule setters, and they happen again and again and again. The history of Christianity is full, charged, stuffed with examples of modernizers. Judaism is stuffed with examples of modernizers. Buddhism is stuffed with examples of modernizers. In a real sense, lived religion is uncomfortable with the modernizers, because lived religion is messier and usually a target, something that the modernizers don't like. But maybe the challenge would be to find some way to incorporate the modernizers into the history of lived religion. Now, I want to conclude here because I've talked too long already. I love the question about conversion and lived religion. I love it because I love it as a challenge. I don't love you, but I love the question. I love it because it points to a real problem for lived religion, which is, as we've heard all today and through these papers and my lecture earlier today, and you quote me from the introduction, it's not about sustaining boundaries, it's about breaking through boundaries. But conversion is very definitely about coming to a real boundary thing. You know you have changed. You used to be this, and now you are this. It's very, very clear. And there's also the question of origins that you get to. So so there are two ways of thinking about conversion. One is that it's never really as complete as the word suggests. It's never really totally complete. And I think that can be demonstrated in a lot of cases. In other words, you bring with you baggage from what you were before. That's one way of thinking about conversion. The other is that the religion to which you move, to which you are converted, is not simple. It's not simple. And can I just remark, the man you talk about, the visions, the spirit driving away, this reminds me of Pentecostalism, radical Pentecostalism. And I wonder about Origins, if he had somehow come in touch with underground Pentecostalism, because Pentecostalism would validate everything that he is having as an experience, the visions, the exorcisms, the so forth and so on. And I think your Melissa Inouye's dissertation, Harvard student's dissertation that some of you are familiar with, about the founding of the True Jesus Church. And the founding of the True Jesus Church is linked biographically to a Dutch missionary in China who went to Southern California hearing of the Azusa Street revival, speaking in tongues, came back to China, spoke in tongues. Norwegian, sorry. And the founder of the True Jesus Church came under his influence, and her argument is that the True Jesus Church has nothing to do with Chinese indigenous religion, everything to do with the influence of Pentecostalism. So origins are a fascinating question to ask in all of this work, and they're often surprising answers to origin stories. And her dissertation, I think, to me, I'm not a specialist, was a surprising story as to the origins of the True Jesus Church. Very, very interesting question. I thank all of you again for your really this terrifically clear and intelligent work.
Well, I should let the four presenters to have further, to bring up your further questions. Would you like to ask some more questions today? Or would you like to continue some discussions Professor Hall just mentioned? No? Okay, if not, we simply can open the following time to our audience. And any questions you would like to raise with respect to the points Professor Hall just mentioned, or perhaps you can ask some questions, and about those presenters' ideas and what they are concerned about. Yeah.
Hello, I'm David Blondell, and I just got in from India last night, where I gave a keynote for the United Nations World Peace Conference. And my work in India has something to do with what David just mentioned about conversion. In 1956, in October, that's just 60 years ago, there was a Dr. Ambedkar who decided that he would convert to Buddhism. He was a Dalit, untouchable, below the caste, and he had been thinking for 20 years about Buddhism, and decided on October 14th of 56 he was going to ask in Nagpur, the geographic center of India, his people who were untouchable to congregate there at that place, and he himself embraced Buddhism and asked his people to follow him. And they did. About 500,000 people stood up to embrace Buddhism. So it is called the world's largest mass conversion. But this idea to convert as an untouchable, not to have a god, not to step in a temple, otherwise you will pollute it. Your very shadow, if it crosses the path of a caste Hindu, will pollute the person. You must rush home and take a spiritual cleansing bath. And yet, to liberate, to release from being untouchable, Dr. Ambedkar, he decided, we call him Dr. Ambedkar because he studied at Columbia University, got his doctorate in 3 years in economics, went to London, got another degree in another PhD in economics, another doctorate in law, returned to India to be unemployed because he was untouchable. So he became a labor leader for his people. He sparred and had many conflicts with Gandhi, who decided that he himself would, as a high caste, wealthy Hindu, regard himself as the leader of the untouchable people. The untouchable people disagreed with that. And so Dr. Ambedkar actually, he became the first law minister of India. He was able to frame the Constitution of India on the recommendation of Gandhi, who decided that he was the only qualified person to do so. But he himself was struggling with his beliefs, his religion, as an untouchable. How could he call himself Hindu if he was below the caste? Today in India there are 200 million untouchable people below the caste who are considered polluted people. And yet, in numbers, they are counted as Hindu. So the whole idea of the conversion to Buddhism, and still today many untouchable people are embracing Buddhism, but yet they had nothing before that. They were polluted, untouchable, Hindu, and then they embrace Buddhism or convert, and yet they know nothing about Buddhism. Not anything at all. They're practically illiterate, they have no education, they're very poor, they're village servants, they live in trash shelters, houses built of trash, outside the cities. It's really, and so their only emancipation is to embrace Buddhism. Then they get assistance, they get international help. There are international Buddhist communities, the Japanese, the Taiwanese especially help them. Taiwanese, in a very big way, has achieved foundation in Hualien, engaged Buddhists. And this whole idea, of course, engaged Buddhism, you mentioned the work of early Chinese humanistic Buddhists, like Taishu. So actually started from China, the so-called engaged Buddhist humanistic movement of Buddhism that is found today alive in Taiwan and helping those people in India. But it's, but I agree completely with Professor Hall that you cannot really convert because you can embrace. I use the word embracement. You can embrace the faith, or you can become Buddhist. You're on a long path to become Buddhist somehow, but you cannot really convert. That is my comment.
Any response to Professor Randall's example or any other comments? Yeah.
I just follow up the question about the situation in India. I think, well, Dr. Hall already talked about modernization as a common thing of all the paper and all the talk about today. So I was wondering, can Dr. Hall or maybe others can continue talking about this? Because I think each religion has different format in the more industrial, more Western society than a religion in the post-colonial society, because apparently they are living in very different environments. And also in the post-colonial society, the political forces try to, no matter it's about promoting the nationalism or promoting just try to fight back the so-called cultural invasion or any kind of outside influence. I think the case would be very obvious in a country like China, right? So even we not so keen to the idea about modernization, but it is unavoidable and undeniable that many politicians and many social elites, they kind of working on this concept and to push religion from one direction to another.
At the end of this morning's my talk, a young woman who may be here, I'm not sure, I don't think she is here, came to me and asked what was the relationship between lived religion and the notion of global religious societies in conflict. That religion is at the basis of global geopolitical conflict. And this is a concept or an argument that's dates back now 20, 25, 30 years, that the 21st century politics is going to be based on religion. And a man no longer living named Stanley Hoffman at Harvard promoted this theory that Western civilization was at risk from this new global religious politics, which did not favor democracy or whatever. So this is not what lived religion is about. I had to say to her, I can't help you with your question because lived religion is not good at that scale of question. That's one of its severe limitations. On the other hand, if you turn the question about empires, came up empires but even yesterday, on Monday. So let me acknowledge the relevance of the question because nationalism, anti-colonialism, is part of my national history in a paradoxical way because we threw off the British, although we were British, we threw them off, but for the most part not entirely. But patriotism, the meaning of America, all of these remain in sharp dispute, as you can tell from this current election campaign. Very, very sharp dispute. So, and religion gets involved in that. So even on a more domestic scale, just within the United States, one could argue that religion is implicated in a much larger politics of power, partly regional, partly economic, partly demographic, so forth and so on. So, but as I say, lived religion could do local versions of that, but I don't think it can theorize well about the larger story. It's too large a story. It involves different categories. It involves, for one thing, the structure of the nation. It has to use the structure of the nation. Or it has to use religion as something, not a particular practices, but as a larger concept of what religion, the religious is. And so here we are at a point where it's only fair, only appropriate, correct, I think, to say there are limits to what lived religion can do. It's not good at the those big questions. It's not that those big questions aren't just as important as other kinds of questions. There's no hierarchy here. Good questions, bad questions. No hierarchy. But that's how I feel myself. I did want to say, by the way, that your quotation from Mr. Clark, Arthur Clark, is pure Durkheimian. It's pure Durkheim. He stole it from Durkheim. You know, that religion reflects our social needs. That's what Durkheim said. So, but only people who study religion professionally know what Durkheim said. So it's, you know, you can make up anything you want. But it's not such an original idea, actually, that religion reflects our needs. Sorry, I'll stop here. We'll get the clock.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So in the end of your lecture earlier today, you end with a contrast between a lived religion and a vicarious religion. And by pointing out that, under your definition, understanding of lived religion, you put the emphasis on the importance of institutions, right? And by that way, you try to mark a boundary against the so-called notion of vicarious religion. But that led me into some kind of worry about the future of lived religion, because suppose some of the supporters of the vicarious religious scholars are right, then maybe in a few decades, all the major institutions, religious institutions, say for example in the U.S., will become so weak that a good amount of percentage of the people will become nuns. Okay, so if in that case, my worry will be, the very idea of lived religion will naturally pass away and merge into vicarious religion. So that's sort of my worry. So in a few decades, then everybody naturally becomes a supporter of vicarious religion. So that's my concern. And the reason why I mentioned this is because I was struck by Zhiying's earlier comment this morning about her mother, right? So suppose, because in my understanding, in the history of Chinese religion, if I may, it's the same situation already happened. Maybe more than one time, maybe in the Tang Dynasty or later, maybe in the Song Dynasty. There was already this idea of merging different religious traditions into one. And the main reason behind that, I suspect, was because some of the institutions became weak or non-institutionalized. But still, the idea, the religious idea, still floating around, so that people still subscribe, endorse to those ideas without recognizing, okay, these are originally religious ideas. So that's why nowadays most people here, subscribe, endorse to more than one religious tradition. So in that sense, I wonder if you can comment on the future of lived religion.
Well, I deliberately called attention to the vicarious religion, which, by the way, was developed by a sociologist of religion in Western Europe. So it's, at the moment, specific to the situation in not every part of Western Europe, but much of Western Europe. I'm sorry to repeat myself, it helps to have lived a long time, because concepts have come and gone in my lifetime. If I were to put together a list of the concepts that, when I was in graduate school, seemed so important, they've all gone. They've just disappeared, no longer important. So, if the ship carrying lived religion began to sink, okay, it did useful work at one point in time, very useful work at one point in time, and that's all I hope for. That's all I have hopes for. But let's turn your comment around. Is vicarious religion a sufficient term for what is happening today? So there needs to be a sharp sociological history of religions questions asked about the present situation as we see it developing. And the one certainty we know is that the term secularization is inadequate, because it seems to indicate no religion, whereas vicarious religion allows for some religion, or Dr. Hervieux Léger, the French one, her religion as memory allows for some religion. It's not that in France no one goes to church or no one prays their children to be baptized. Some people still do. But what's more important, as I say, I have no. It may surprise you. It was fun to have the concept and develop it and have others take it up, including Professor Emmerman. And I have no tensions with her about everyday religion. No. And no Grace Davy, vicarious religion. Fine. Because we are living in an extraordinary moment. The collapse of the authority of religious institutions in Europe is without precedent. I'll just throw in since autobiography is on the table, I'll throw in an autobiographical comment. I have spent a lot of time in rural France walking. I like to walk, long distance walking. And there are no more priests in rural France today than there were after the French Revolution. The French Revolution crushed, eliminated the Catholic Church. It's very hard to find a priest. So you go to a church, there's a phone number. If someone dies, call this number. And maybe within a day or two, a priest will turn up. But the person's already dead, so it's sort of meaningless. That's the situation. There are no priests. It's a completely denuded landscape. Churches are locked. You can't even get into the churches. If you want to say a prayer, they're all locked. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Maybe in the big towns there's still a church that's open, or a tourist church, a famous church is open. So it's really striking. It's astonishing, really. Just amazing to see how unreligious, except there are the buildings, the old buildings, the landscape is in France. And heaven help us, don't go to a service. So I do want to go back to the question of conversion just for one brief moment, because I left out a thought. So when historians ask, how did the Christian message spread in the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity? And the question is, did people convert? Go back to the point that was made here. Or your point, I'm sorry, about conversion. The answer is, if someone in the kinship network converted, everyone else in the kinship network joined Christianity. It's a kinship network system. It did not require 95% of the people who converted to Christianity to believe anything at all. So you're 500,000 people converting overnight because they're untouchables is not that far removed from how Christianity developed in the early centuries. And the other key circumstance is the report of a miracle, some supernatural event, which of course were stories. They're not always complicated. Did they occur or didn't they occur? But the story of a healing, and going back to your, is often at the core of those early centuries worth of conversion, and still to this day in certain ways. So conversion becomes, again, a very complicated category. What does it mean if your mother converts and then, by the way, the history of Mormonism is a perfect example of this. The history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, an American church, now international. Joseph Smith has a vision. He tells his mother, he says, I'm going to organize a church. And at the moment of organizing the church in April of 1830, he baptizes his own father. He baptizes his brothers, his sisters-in-law, his mother. It's a kinship network. That's what it is. It's a kinship network, following the example of this son. And Mormonism today, its great strength is that it's kinship-based. It's a kinship-based religion in the most extraordinary way. A phenomenally inventive kinship network where you baptize your ancestors. So again, that complicates the meaning of the, I think you would agree, it complicates conversion is such a complicated word. We think of it like Paul on the road to Tarsus, the great Christian example. Zap! Jesus speaks to him, he falls off his mule or donkey, whatever it was, converted. That's not the way it works for most people.
The other theme that has been presented this morning, I believe, is on literacy and religion. And I have a MOST grant to study how religions moved out from India through Austronesian navigation into the islands of Indonesia, the Pacific area. And so in the summer, I've been tracing Buddhism through Sumatra, Java, Bali, Sulawesi, and finding where and the extent of the transmission of Buddhism happened from 2,300 years ago. And 2,300 years ago, the first transmission out of India, again, was by sea travel to Sri Lanka. Sangamati, a nun with the votary, came to Sri Lanka, and a monk by the name of Mahinda. And Mahinda proposed to the king of Sri Lanka, Tisa, who happened to be hunting in his deer park at the time, that Mahintale, if Sri Lanka would accept Buddhism, as offered by King Ashoka. And Tisa replied very cleverly. He said, well, yes, we will embrace Buddhism if you send a teacher to give literacy to my people in every village. And that was done. And so Sri Lanka became literate at the village level 2,300 years ago. I believe it's the first nation to take literacy. Until today, Sri Lanka has the highest level of literacy in South Asia. So I followed this further to Indonesia, and finally by July of this year, I got the idea that Buddhism continued, not only Buddhism, but Indic beliefs with literacy as far as people accepted literacy, thus the religion from India. Because why didn't Buddhism go to Micronesia or into Polynesia? All of the Austronesian languages are of the oral tradition, and only those of Indonesia and Malaysia accepted religion from India based on literacy and the extent of literacy. Although I was a visiting scholar also this year at the East West Center in Hawaii, and I was able to trace Indic words from Java. Hawaii was settled in the 7th century, also Madagascar. So the Austronesians, they got across the Indian Ocean, East Africa, Madagascar, and to Polynesia. This is the language system that evolved and came out of Taiwan earlier with navigation, all the way to Hawaii with Indic vocabulary. So it sort of proves that actually the Austronesians were going to Polynesia and returning to Indonesia, and then back to Polynesia. They were circulating, and then of course they came back to Taiwan. They weren't everywhere because they were navigators with their language, the lingua franca of trade in the region. So as far as I could figure out, Sulawesi was the furthest extent of Buddhism, where you could find the Candi, the stupa, relics of the Buddha, bronze Buddha, from the 5th to the 9th century, that were carried out of India and brought to Sulawesi by navigation, Austronesian navigators. especially in Indonesia. I found literacy actually to be that extent of the religion. And in Sri Lanka, excuse me, has had a civil war for 26 years. Madeleine Albright, in the speech, said that it was an example of a religious civil war. Boy, she got a lot of trouble by that comment, because religion had nothing to do with the civil war. Because the Buddhists in Sri Lanka, they also believe in the Hindu gods. The gods that are Hindu protect the Buddha in Sri Lanka. It's not anything to do with 26 years of civil war of religion. It is simply politics. It's a political war for a Tamil to have their separate state. And there were 5 Tamil armies, but they were separate armies because of their caste. Hinduism is not a single belief; it's a caste belief. And so, also the Sinhalese, who are Buddhists, also have caste, a different caste system. So it had nothing to do with their social structure, their lineage, or whatever religion. It was simply a political quest of some Tamil leaders who would like to create a separate state, a Tamil state.
Any response or further questions? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Sorry. So it is 11. I'm a PhD student at University of Virginia, studying anthropology. My question is not related with Professor Blondel's question, but it's related with Professor Xian's case study about forgiving to the homeless. Try to relate it with Professor Hall's response about the doubleness of gift giving in Christianity. Because according to Curti's report, those individual food givers, they are so reluctant to any institutional mediation or state intervention when they are doing the so-called charity or gift giving or food giving. And but they do have some religious background, like knowledge. For example, when they are giving, they are saying 创造一个善缘, or we are creating a virtuous relation with you. It sounds very Buddhist, but we know the idea of charity in Buddhism and in Christianity are kind of very different. In Buddhism, it may be like we are creating a karmic debt with you. But when Curti was debriefing his case study, he did not specify those food givers. What kind of religious background? Maybe some of them are Christians, but their idea, at least I'm creating a virtuous relation with you, sounds so Buddhist. So my first question is, Curti maybe give us a little bit specific examples of those food givers. 1 or 2 is okay. And second is, especially as anthropologists, we are concerned about those recipients. Do they feel any moral obligation or moral commitment toward those food givers? Because it may create a kind of, I don't know, we cannot term it religiosity, but there are certainly some kind of individualized connections. Maybe they will form in the community in the future, we don't know yet. So some, for now, it's just individualized relation. So just like these 2 questions.
So actually, in my field, I can find a couple of churches doing charity work to provide some meals to these homeless people. It's very obvious that there exists a difference between this Christian and I think Buddhist or folk believers who give donation to these homeless people. So I think this is also related to the point Professor Hall just raised about the pure gift. He mentioned that even though theologically it's pure gift, however, usually the Christian will require or ask for some obligation from the gift receivers. This very obvious in my field. Those church leaders will require these homeless people to change their behavior. They will ask them to stand in line. You must be respectful to the people who serve you. However, this never happened among these folk believers who give any donations. They just think it's enough to develop a virtuous ability with you right now. You receive the food, that's all, and I receive the merit. That's great. So actually, the homeless people like these folk believers more because they are more friendly. What they give is more like pure gift. However, the Christian just want something from you. They want to change you into the role model they desire. For them, that's not what Jesus said. Actually, they understand the Bible. And they said that Jesus being so good to the prostitute. Why you, this pastor, ask so much from us? You cast stones toward us. That's so weird. So they refuse to go into a church when they have food or other stuff, other resources. So I think it's very pathetic to Christian. I also talked to this pastor about this situation. They are struggling, just like what Professor Hall just mentioned, that they know they have to act like Jesus to give without thinking about the return. However, the larger, the mega church who give money to them, ask them to have some report, and they want some report. It's kind of institutional requirement. So I think it's very interesting to compare these two kinds of religious systems in terms of charity.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I also found that some of you who just present your own cases mentioned a lot of phenomena which seem to me like a Shelaism. The word coined by I think by Robert Penner, or that's in sociology. Another thing is like syncretism, which was very popular in the 80s, among anthropology of the religion. And so whenever the Chinese and scholars of Chinese religion were talking about that kind of hybridity of different religious aspects in Chinese context, and people then tend to say, well, that's syncretism. And so I'm not sure how would you compare socialism, that is a religion out of your making. You take one from there, another from other places, and you combine it into an ideal, religion which you want, and that's a socialism. So how would you compare this kind of concepts or terminology with deep religion? It seems that we tend to mix up these terms.
Could I ask back in the program here, do you still use the word syncretism?
We sometimes read articles on that, but I know it's a kind of very ambiguous term. But ambiguous not necessarily means bad. Sometimes good.
In the United States, it's disappeared because of it's disappeared in part because of political correctness. So that it used to be used about Native Americans. Native Americans had a syncretistic religion, especially those who converted to Christianity. And now, out of a wish to assign Native Americans full authority over their own lives, syncretism looks as though they have surrendered some of their native traditions. And so no one uses the word syncretism anymore because it seems to, now all of you, thank goodness you're not an American. You know, you should be very pleased that you're here in Taiwan or other places as well. And you can since you've sometimes taught in America, and Justin has studied America, you know, there are political currents that flow through the study of religion. Study of religion is not immune to a larger political struggles over identity, the politics of identity. And so lived religion as it arose seemed more or less free from that politics. It seemed open to, you know, various kinds of politics. And that's one of its appeals, is it doesn't seem tainted by, like syncretism became tainted, or world religions became a tainted category. You know, like as you were saying, there used to be as Hinduism and Buddhism became tainted. So there is a kind of ongoing crisis of terminology in the Western study of religion. You know, words like canon or scripture, all these are words that mysticism, they're all tainted words, experience. And lived religion, I mean, no one here has asked what the word religion means in lived religion. And don't ask me, because I don't know what it means. Similarly, there are those who said, when the first arose, well, what is unlived religion? You know, so don't ask me what lived religion is. But the phrase lived religion has a kind of power to it. In part, just saying response to this question. But I love what you just said about the because it goes back to my point made yesterday, Monday in particular, that evangelical Protestantism in particular is always a disciplinary religion. Protestantism in general is disciplinary, but evangelical missionary Protestantism is very disciplinary. There's a right way to live, to use time, to use your body, you know, to clean yourself, to turn up, and I can just imagine, I hate imagining, but I can just imagine precisely what you have just described, namely that here's this wonderful free gift, but you have to do all this stuff. And like you, if I were a beggar, I might rather enjoy the more casual folk religion version of this. It's interesting. I give money to a homeless shelter in Massachusetts, in Boston. A little money. I won't give you the backstory there. And I occasionally go and serve a meal there to the homeless people. That's my gift. And this shelter bends over backwards, not to be explicitly disciplinary when it's giving meals. But there are the big posters. Enter our job training program. You know, we will train you for work. You know? So now you're homeless, but you're miserable. Our job training program will make you happy. You know, so, and that's a very disciplined path to follow. You know, so right there in the mealtime, meal is free. Nobody's doing, but there's the big poster, enter the job training program, which is good. That's not bad. But it's, again, an example of how the gift and obligation, or gift and discipline, get very, very tied together. And when I read sermons, sadly I have to read a lot of sermons from my work in the 17th century. Every sermon starts with, God loves you, sacrificed the Son, and then that's the first part of the sermon. Then there's this long, long list of things you must do. Yeah. All right. I want to just say again how much pleasure I felt listening to the papers. I think that's shared by everyone here. Very clear, very beautifully compact, put together, raising interesting questions that we could only begin to fully explore. We cannot fully explore here. I appreciate the visual aspects that some of you used. too. If I were in America, I would have stood up and sort of running up and down like the blackboard here, talking about things, but I didn't do that here. Didn't want to frighten you with all that motion. But again, I appreciate very much. I want to applaud all of you.
Okay, I think our time is up at this moment. I would like to thank the four presenters first, and then also Professor Hall, for your very insightful responses. And also thank you all your audience for your participation. And tomorrow, we will have the third lecture, by Professor Hall at Academia Sinica, as also the sociology of Institute of Sociology. Okay, on the 8th floor, room A03. Okay, 803, room 803. So I would also invite you, to go there to listen to Professor's last talk. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh yeah. Could I ask you to move, towards that direction, and we will have a group.